A deeper knowledge of God and the terror of the soul. In the beginning, God lets himself be known as holiness, justice, goodness, that is to say, mercy. The soul does not come to know this all at once, but piecemeal, in flashes, that is to say, when God draws near, and this does not last for long, because the soul could not bear such light. During prayer, the soul experiences flashes of this light, which make it impossible to pray as before. Try as it may to force itself to pray as it did before, all is in vain. It becomes completely impossible for it to continue to pray as it did before it received this light. This light which has touched the soul is alive within it, and nothing can either quench or diminish it. This flash of the knowledge of God draws the soul and enkindles its love for him. But this same flash, at the same time, allows the soul to know itself as it is. The soul sees its whole interior in a superior light, and it rises up alarmed and terrified. Still it does not remain under the effects of terror, but it begins to purify itself, to humble and abase itself before the Lord. These lights become stronger and more frequent. The more the soul is crystallized, the more these lights penetrate it. However, if the soul has responded faithfully and courageously to these first graces, God fills it with his consolations and gives himself to it in a perceptible manner. At certain moments, the soul, as it were, enters into an intimacy with God and greatly rejoices in this. It believes that it has already reached the degree of perfection destined for it, because its defects and faults are asleep within it, and this makes it think that they no longer exist. Nothing seems difficult for it. It is ready for everything. It begins to plunge itself into God and taste the divine delights. It is carried along by grace and does not take account of the fact that the time of trial and testing may come. And, in fact, this state does not last long. Other moments will soon come. I should add here, however, that the soul will respond more faithfully to divine grace if it has a well-informed confessor, to whom it can confide everything. Trials sent by God to a soul which is particularly loved by him. Temptations and darkness, Satan. The soul's love for God is still not such as God would have it. The soul suddenly loses the tangible perception of God's presence. Various defects and imperfections rise up within it, and it must fight them furiously. All her faults lift up their heads, but the soul's vigilance is great. The former awareness of the presence of God gives place to coldness and spiritual dryness. The soul has no taste for spiritual exercises. It cannot pray, either in the old way or in the manner in which it had just begun to pray. It struggles this way and that, but can find no satisfaction. God has hidden himself from it, and it can find no consolation in creatures, nor can any of these creatures find a way of consoling it. The soul craves passionately for God, but sees its own misery. It begins to sense God's justice. It seems to it that it has lost all the gifts that God had given it. Its mind is dimmed, and darkness fills it. Unspeakable torment begins. The soul tries to explain its state to the confessor, but it is not understood, and is assailed by an even greater unrest. Satan begins his work. Faith staggers under the impact. The struggle is fierce. The soul tries hard to cling to God by an act of will. With God's permission, Satan goes even further. Hope and love are put to the test. These temptations are terrible. God supports the soul in secret, so to speak. The soul is not aware of this, but otherwise it would be impossible to stand firm, and God knows very well how much he can allow to befall a soul. The soul is tempted to unbelief in respect to revealed truths and to insincerity toward the confessor. Satan says to it, "Look, no one understands you. Why speak about all this?" Words that terrify it sound in its ears, and it seems to the soul that it is uttering these against God. It sees what it does not want to see. It hears what it does not want to hear. And oh, it is a terrible thing at times like these not to have an experienced confessor. The soul carries the whole burden alone. However, one should make very effort to find it. If it is all possible, a well-informed confessor, for the soul can collapse under the burden and come to the very edge of the precipice. All these trials are heavy and difficult. God does not send them to a soul which has not already been admitted to a deeper intimacy with Him, and which has not yet tasted the divine delights. Besides, in this God has His own plans, which for us are impenetrable. God often prepares a soul in this way for His future designs and great works. He wants to try it as a pure gold is tried. But this is not yet the end of the testing. There is still the trial of trials, the complete abandonment of the soul by God. The trial of trials, complete abandonment, despair. When the soul comes out victorious from the preceding trials, even though it may stumble here and there, it fights on valiantly, humbly calling upon God. Save me, I am perishing, and it is still able to fight on. At this point, however, the soul is engulfed in a horrible night. It sees within itself only sin. It feels terrible. It sees itself completely abandoned by God. It feels itself to be the object of His hatred. It is but one step away from despair. The soul does its best to defend itself. It tries to stir up its confidence, but prayer is an even greater torment for it, as this prayer seems to arouse God to an even greater anger. The soul finds itself poised on the summit of a lofty mountain, on the very brink of a precipice. The soul is drawn to God, but feels repulsed. All other sufferings and tortures in the world are as nothing compared with this sensation into which it has been plunged, namely that of being rejected by God. No one can bring it any relief. It finds itself completely alone. There is no one to defend it. It raises its eyes to heaven, but is convinced that this is not for her. For her, all is lost. It falls deeper and deeper from darkness to darkness, and it seems to it that it has lost forever the God it used to love so dearly. This thought is torture beyond all description. But the soul does not agree to it, and tries to lift its gaze toward heaven, but in vain, and this makes the torture even more intense. If God wishes to keep the soul in such darkness, no one will be able to give it light. It experiences rejection by God in a vivid and terrifying manner. From its heart burst forth painful moans, so painful that no priest will comprehend it, unless he himself has been through these trials. In the midst of this, the evil spirit adds to the soul's suffering, mocking it. Will you persist in your faithfulness? This is your reward. You are in our power. But Satan has only as much influence over the soul as God allows him, and God knows how much we can bear. What have you gotten out of your mortification, says Satan, and out of your fidelity to the rule? What use are all these efforts? You have been rejected by God. This word rejected becomes a fire which penetrates every nerve to the marrow of the bone. It pierces right through her entire being. The ordeal reaches its climax. The soul no longer looks for help anywhere. It shrinks into itself and loses sight of everything. It is as though it has accepted the torture of being abandoned. This is a moment for which I have no words. This is the agony of the soul. When for the first time this moment was drawing near, I was snatched from it by virtue of holy obedience. The directress of novices, alarmed by my appearance, sent me off to confession. But the confessor did not understand me, and I experienced no relief whatsoever. O Jesus, give us experienced priests. When I told this priest I was undergoing infernal tortures, he answered that he was not worried about my soul, because he saw in it a great grace of God. But I understood nothing of this, and not even the least glimmer of light broke through my soul. Then my physical strength began to fail me, and I could no longer carry out my duties, nor could I any longer hide my sufferings. Although I did not say a word about them, the look of pain on my face betrayed me. The superiors told me that the sisters had come to her saying that, when they look at me in the chapel, they are moved to pity because I look so terrible. Yet despite all efforts, the soul is unable to conceal such suffering. Jesus, you alone know how the soul, engulfed in darkness, moans in the midst of these torments, and, despite all this, thirst for God as burning lips thirst for water. It dies and withers. It dies a death without death. That is to say, it cannot die. All the efforts come to nothing. It is under a powerful hand. Now the soul comes under the power of the Just One. All exterior temptation ceases, all that surrounds it becomes silent, like a dying person who loses contact with everything around it. The person's entire soul is in the hand of the just God, the thrice holy God, rejected for all eternity. This is the culminating moment, and God alone can test a soul in this way, because He alone knows that the soul can endure it. When a soul has been saturated true and true by this infernal fire, it is, as it were, cast headlong into great despair. My soul experienced this moment when I was all alone in my cell. When my soul began to sink into this despair, I felt that the end was near, but I seized my little crucifix and clutched it tightly in my hand. And now I felt my body separate itself from my soul. And though I wanted to go to my superiors, I no longer had the physical strength. I uttered my last words, "I trust in your mercy." And it seemed to me that I provoked God to an even greater anger. And now I was drowned in despair, and all that was left with me was a moan of unalterable pain, which from time to time tore itself from my soul. The soul is in agony, and it seemed to me that I would remain in this state, because by my own strength I could not emerge from it. Every recollection of God opened up an unspeakable ocean of suffering, and yet despite this there is something within the soul which is drawn to Him. Through it seems to her for this only, that she suffers more. The memory of the love with which God formerly surrounded it is still another kind of suffering. His gaze pierces it, and everything within the soul is burned by this gaze. After some time, one of the sisters came into the cell and found me almost dead. She was frightened and went to the directress of novices, who, in the name of holy obedience, ordered me to get up from the ground. My strength returned immediately, and I got up, trembling. The directress recognized immediately the state of my soul, and spoke to me about the inscrutable mercy of God, saying, "Do not be distressed about anything, sister. I command this of you in virtue of obedience." Then she said to me, "I see now, sister, that God is calling you to a high degree of holiness. The Lord wants to draw you very close to Himself, since He has allowed these things to happen to you so soon. Be faithful to God, sister, because this is a sign that He wants you to have a high place in heaven." However, I did not understand anything of these words. When I went into the chapel, I felt as though my soul had been set free from everything, as though it had just come forth from the hand of God. I pierced the inviolability of my soul. I felt that I was a tiny child. Suddenly I saw the Lord interiorly, and He said to me, "Fear not, my daughter, I am with you." In that single moment, all the darkness and torments vanished. My senses were inundated with unspeakable joy, and the faculties of my soul filled with light.